Hello, fellow teachers. This is Teaching with Power, and today I'm going to give you insights and ideas to help you teach Acts chapter 10 through 15 with relevancy, impact, and power. And this material complements the lesson for July 15th through the 21st in the Come Follow Me manual. As you're watching, if you find this material helpful, I'd love it if you hit the like and the subscribe buttons and consider sharing this channel with other people, because that's what's going to make the channel more visible and hopefully help others who may also need some help teaching and understanding the Scriptures. For an icebreaker, I like to ask, what is the strangest dream you've ever had? Now, this is a really fun question, and in my experience can spark a lively, funny, and really interesting discussion. I know I have some really weird ones that are pretty funny, and I'm sure they will too. But don't let it get away from you, though. A few minutes is sufficient before you transition into the Scriptures with, today we'll look at a fascinating dream or vision that Peter has in Acts chapter 10 that will change everything for the early Christian church and really the rest of history. Peter has been preaching to Jews throughout Judea and has made his way to the seaside village of Joppa. He's staying with a man named Simon the tanner in a house by the seaside. See if you can find how Peter is feeling before this dream comes in verses 9 through 10. The answer is that he's hungry, and I think there's some symbolic meaning in that's when the dream comes. And while he's waiting for lunch, the Scriptures say he goes into a trance, or he falls asleep, or has a vision. Maybe the message here is, don't go to sleep hungry, or you'll have strange dreams. But anyway, have a volunteer read the vision for the group in verses 11 through 16. And Peter sees this giant blanket full of animals come down out of the sky, and the voice of the Lord commanding him to eat. And you may want to point out that the Jews had, and continue to have, very strict dietary rules. Maybe they've heard of the term kosher before, or they know that Jews don't eat pork. And if they're interested in knowing what some of the animals Peter might be seeing in the blanket, they can check out footnote 14a, which will send them to Leviticus chapter 11, which actually has some really good advice, like don't eat bats and weasels and ferrets and lizards. I'm sure you've been tempted to eat some of those, but don't. They're unclean. But God commands him to eat some of those things, and he's like, no, I've never eaten anything unclean. I don't want that pig in a blanket. It would be like God commanding you to take a drink of a can of beer or smoke a cigarette. It would just be a very foreign idea and very hard to accept. Now, don't go into the interpretation of the vision just yet. Here you're going to say, there's another very important character in this story that I need to introduce you to. And this sets you up for the super lame joke, but I always get a kick out of it. And so I ask, does anybody know who the first rock star of the New Testament was? And the answer's in verse 1, and it's Cornelius and his Italian band. And yeah, I know that's bad, but you may get a chuckle or at least a few well-deserved groans out of that one. But yes, Cornelius, he is a very important character in this story. And send them into the following verses to see what they can discover about Cornelius. Acts chapter 10, verse 1, 2, and 22. And there they'll learn that he was a centurion, or a soldier in the Roman army. He's a devout man, or a religious faithful man. He fears or respects God. He gives alms, which means he's charitable. He prays. He's just. Again, they repeat that he fears God. And he's of good report among all the nation of the Jews. So he has a reputation amongst the Jews for being a good leader. So all around, Cornelius is a great guy. His only problem, I guess, really, is that he's not Jewish. Well, what happens to him? As the teacher, read verses 3 through 8, where an angel directs Cornelius to send for Peter down in Joppa. Which maybe I'll share a quick truth I see in that. The angel could have just delivered the message of the gospel to Cornelius himself, but he sends Peter to him, which teaches me that more often than not, God chooses to work through his chosen earthly ministers. And I think that can apply to us. We may be praying for some answer from God, and I do believe that he often will answer our prayers directly. But we shouldn't rule out the possibility that he may prefer to answer us through his chosen leaders. So maybe we should go to a bishop, or a parent, or search the words of the living prophets for our counsel and answers. He will often help you through them. But now you have these two very different worlds coming together in the rest of the chapter. And as the teacher, I would summarize verses 17 through 26. So remember Peter's dream. He's woken up, and it says in verse 17 that he doubted in himself what the vision should mean. And while he's thinking about it, there's a knock on the door. And who is it? Cornelius' men requesting Peter to come to Caesarea. The Lord tells Peter that he should go with them, and the next day they travel up to Caesarea, and these two men meet. Peter the Jewish fisherman, and Cornelius the Roman centurion. Have your students picture that moment. It's one of the most pivotal and beautiful encounters in history. You couldn't have two men from more different backgrounds than these two. Remind them that typically the Romans despised the Jews, and the Jews in turn hated the Romans and saw them as oppressors and conquerors. Peter even reminds us that it was unlawful for a Jew to keep company with somebody of another nation. Cornelius falls at Peter's feet, to which Peter responds by lifting him up and saying that he's only a man. And Cornelius and all his household are standing there, waiting and wanting to hear Peter's message. And Peter gets it. He understands the dream. And here I would ask, with that set up, do you understand the meaning of the dream? What do you think it means? And let them answer. And you don't need to tell them whether they're right or wrong, just let them try to interpret it. And then say, let's see what conclusion Peter comes to in verse 28. And the answer is that I should not call any man common or unclean. Just as he's been taught his whole life that there are certain animals that are unclean and that he shouldn't go near, he's been taught his whole life that certain people were unclean, but now he knows that he should call no man unclean. Then say, let's flesh that message out in a couple of other verses. He's going to say basically the same thing in 5 different ways to make sure that we get it. See if you can find the message phrase in each of the following verses as well. In verse 34, God is no respecter of persons. In verse 35, it's basically the whole verse. In every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. So it's faith and righteousness that matter, not where or how you were born. Verse 36, he is Lord of all. And then the Lord reiterates that point visually in verse 45. And what happens there to send the message? And it says that on the Gentiles also was poured out the gift of the Holy Ghost. And then the chapter ends with Peter baptizing them. Now I'm going to take a second to hopefully help you sense the gravity and importance of what has happened here. Whether you decide to include any of this in your lesson or not, it's up to you. But remember that the apostles and early disciples of the church really struggled to understand certain key aspects of Christ's mission. In my mind, they had 3 great misunderstandings that they had to overcome. 1, the Messiah will come to save us from the oppressing power of Rome. 2, the Messiah will save us by the power of his military might. And 3, the Messiah will come to save all Jewish people. Now 1 and 2 have already been clarified in the Gospels. They've learned that in fact, Christ came to save us from sin and death, not Roman soldiers. And 2, Christ saves us by the power of his atonement and resurrection, not his military power. But now 3, the last great question they had to answer. The message of this victory over sin and death and the gospel that Jesus taught was for who? When Jesus said back in Mark 16:15, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature," they interpreted that to mean preach the gospel to every Jewish creature. But what was the truth of the matter? Acts 10 clarified everything. The gospel was to literally go into all the world and all people, not just Jews. God is no respecter of persons, and anybody who comes unto him is accepted. And who did God choose to represent that change, that opening of his truth and power to all the world? A Roman centurion living in the city of Caesarea. I mean, the name of the city itself represents all that the Jews despised. And not just a Roman, but a Roman soldier, a person that above all else represented the type of person they originally thought the Messiah would come to save them from, not come to save. And the world changes from this moment on, this beautiful and critical moment where a Roman centurion felt that a Jewish fisherman had something of value to give to him, and a Jewish fisherman felt that a Roman centurion was worth giving it to. And Peter willingly gives him that beautiful gift. And through Cornelius, he gives it to all of us. Not just the gift of the Holy Ghost and baptism, but the gift of the Jewish people. All those wonderful stories from the Old Testament, topped off by the teachings and ministry of the Savior himself. All that light and truth and power that God had poured into that tiny nation for centuries was now ready for the world. And God, from the previous chapter, had just the man to do it. Paul, more than anybody else, will grasp that vision of this change and spread that message throughout the ancient world. He's got the man to do it, and he just needs to open that door. And that door is opened in Acts chapter 10. Now, to liken the scriptures, ask, what message do you see for us in this chapter? And depending on your audience, that may be all you need. But a little teaching suggestion here, sometimes your audience may need a little prompting. And I don't do this all the time, but sometimes I might display a screen like this or write these up on the board and just give them some things to get them thinking. But then they still have the freedom to choose which one of those truths that connects with them. And here are some of the truths that I see that can come from this chapter. We should spread the gospel to all people. God directs His church through inspired leaders. Church policies can change. We need to guard ourselves against prejudice. We should not place racial, religious, economic, moral, or political walls between ourselves and those that we should share the gospel with. And we should accept all revelations and instructions from the prophet, even those that are challenging. If somebody chooses that last one, I love taking them to verse 29 and asking about the manner in which Peter accepted this perception-shattering revelation. And it says he did it without gainsaying, which means without argument or rebuttal. And also, he says that he went as soon as I was sent for. So how should we accept a prophet's counsel? Without argument and without hesitation. And with a prophet like Russell M. Nelson that's making big policy changes in the church, this is a very applicable principle for us. Do we accept these changes without gainsaying or hesitation? I hope we do. And if you had time, you could also supplement that idea with the story of Rhoda in Acts 12, verses 12 through 17. I love this. Peter is delivered out of prison by an angel, while the rest of the church believes he's going to be executed. So they're praying, and Peter comes and knocks on the door. So this young woman, Rhoda, and this is a great story to point out, especially if you're teaching the youth, she comes to the door, and Peter says it's him. And she is so excited and overjoyed to hear the prophet's voice that she forgets to open the door and runs into the house to tell everybody that it's Peter. So poor Peter's still standing out there knocking until they come back to let him in. But I love that idea. She's such a great example to me. And I have to ask myself, do I find joy in the voice of the prophets? When General Conference comes around, do I say, "Yay, 8 full hours of listening to the prophets speak. I can't wait"? Or do we say, "Oh boy, General Conference is here. Hope I can stay awake"? I hope that we can react like Rhoda, with joy and excitement. And I suppose the conclusion to this portion of the lesson would depend on what principles your students gravitate towards. Whichever they are, I would testify of those principles and the blessing that you've seen come into your life when you've adhered to them. Moving on to Acts chapter 11, I would just summarize it by pointing out that Peter announces this policy change on teaching Gentiles to the church in Jerusalem, and he rehearses his vision to them. And then also, the members of the church begin to call themselves Christians in Acts chapter 11. Then Acts chapter 12 is a great one. You have these two stories that are right next to each other that it's almost impossible to miss the message in the juxtaposition. So try this activity with them. Tell them to read the following two stories quietly to themselves and to compare them. You've got Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, which is James and Herod. And then you've got Acts chapter 12, verses 3 through 11, which is Peter and Herod. And after they read, ask, what do you notice in the comparison? And I imagine that they're going to recognize that James gets killed by the sword, while an angel comes and rescues Peter. It's really a fun story. He's got 16 men guarding him and 2 guys right next to him, and he's chained to the wall. And then the angel just comes in, the chains fall off his hands, he walks past the guards, the gate opens wide up for him, he just walks out. It's incredible. But after you talk about that, be sure to ask, why did Peter get an angel to rescue him, but James gets the sword? You see this kind of situation happening all over the Scriptures. For example, why do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk through the fiery furnace unscathed, but Abinadi burns? Why do Joseph and Hiram get killed in Carthage jail, but John Taylor and Willard Richards survive? It seems that sometimes God rescues his prophets, and other times he allows others to hurt or kill them. Why? Is it because God loved Peter more than James? Because Peter was more worthy than James? Peter was more important than James? Or is it some other reason? And my personal thoughts on this matter are that oftentimes we tend to focus on the angel stories in the church. We love these stories. They're the ones that end up in the ensign and shared in testimony meetings. The answered prayers, the stories where the person is healed, or there's a car accident but nobody's hurt. And we attribute that to God's love and protection, which we can and should. However, what about the stories where the prayer isn't answered? the person doesn't get healed, where the car accident takes a life. I've had times when I lost something and I prayed to find it, and I did. On the other hand, I can think of times when the object was never found. When my mom got brain cancer, we all prayed that she would be healed, but she died. When my cousin was in a car accident, she didn't survive. Do we assume that those individuals were not as loved by God, that they weren't as worthy, that they weren't as important? I don't think so. I don't think God loved Peter any more than he loved James. I don't think he was more worthy or more important either. I think there's got to be another explanation, and you can ask your students what they think those might be. Here are some of mine. God protects people until their work is done. Abinadi is a good example of this. He's protected until his message to King Noah and the wicked priests was done. Joseph Smith is another. There are so many times where he could have been killed, but when Carthage came, he had said that he felt his work was done. Another reason, God honors the agency of others, even when it hurts good people. You see that in the story of Alma and Amulek, when the righteous women and children are burned. Another reason, one of the purposes of life is to experience pain and suffering and opposition. God is not there to remove all suffering from our lives. This life is not for living happily ever after. That comes in the next life. And there could be many other reasons your students could give, but it's a good discussion to have. And to liken the scriptures, you could ask, how about you? What have your sword experiences taught you? And also, what have your angel experiences taught you? I won't spend as much time on Acts chapters 13 through 14, but let me point out a way to approach these chapters. This is Paul's first missionary journey. And again, just like we saw in Acts chapter 8 with Philip and the Ethiopian man, Paul will teach us what it means to be a great minister or missionary. Here's a quick list of some of the things that I learned. In chapter 13, verse 3, fast and pray. Chapter 13, verse 4, they follow the Spirit. Chapter 13, verses 6 through 12, they help other people recognize false prophets. And this is the story of Bar Jesus, which is really an interesting name for a false prophet. He has Jesus in his name, but it's off a little bit. It's not Jesus, it's Bar Jesus. Just like a counterfeit is close to the real thing, but not quite. Paul exposes this false prophet and smites him with blindness. Now, a good missionary helps others to recognize these false prophets. Nowadays, I think our false prophets are a little bit different. The media is full of false prophets. I would characterize many music and movie and sports, political and intellectual figures as false prophets. It's anybody or anything that seeks to turn us away from the faith. Chapter 13, verses 14 through 43, you have this discourse of Paul where he teaches from the Scriptures and quotes them and helps the people to understand them. A great missionary knows the Scriptures and he teaches from them. Chapter 13, verses 32 and 52, they declare glad tidings. They're positive in their teaching, focusing on what Enos calls the joy of the saints. They're grateful for the gospel, and they teach it in a positive and optimistic tone. Chapter 14, verse 3, they speak boldly and give testimony of the word of grace. In chapter 14, 8 through 10, Paul heals a crippled man. So they seek to heal others, and that could be either through priesthood blessings or spiritual healing as well. Chapter 14, verses 11 through 18, great missionaries are humble and give God the glory. After Paul heals the crippled man, the people of the city think they're gods, and they're about to perform sacrifices to them. Now you think what the average person might do in that situation. Wow, these people think I'm a god. I could really take advantage of this. But Paul doesn't want that focus. He doesn't want the focus to be on him, but God, and he tells them to stop. And if you wanted to, you could compare this story to the one back in Acts chapter 12, verses 20 through 25, about Herod, who gives this speech to a certain area, and the people are probably just kissing up to him, but they're saying, "Oh my goodness, it's the voice of a god, and not of a man." And Herod thinks, "Wow, yeah, I am pretty amazing, aren't I?" And it says an angel smites him, and he's eaten of worms. So a good example of what happens when we don't give God the glory. A great message on the importance of humility. And then I love chapter 14, verses 19 through 22. They go to the cities of Antioch and Iconium to preach. And there they stone Paul, and his companions have to drag him out of the city, thinking that he's dead. So he's nearly stoned to death there. Now he recovers, and they go to a different city, Derbe, for a while. But just look at verse 21. Where does Paul go next? Back to Iconium and Antioch. Now I don't know about you, but if I went somewhere where the people just tried to kill me, I probably wouldn't go back. But Paul is relentless. He's determined. You can't stop him from testifying no matter what happens to him. There are people in those cities that need to be confirmed and strengthened. So at the risk of his own life, he goes back. Great missionaries are determined and relentless in their efforts to teach the gospel. Well, the final chapter, chapter 15, the Jerusalem Conference. There's a big question that has to be resolved in the church. With the announcement that Gentiles will now be accepted into the church, some of the members of the church feel that before you can become a good Christian, you have to become a good Jew first. You see that debate right in verse 1. They say that the Gentiles must be circumcised first before they can join the church. And without going into detail about circumcision, you can imagine that these grown men Gentiles aren't too keen on the idea. But the Jews' logic kind of went like this. They felt that since all the first Christians were Jews first, that a Gentile had to become a Jew, then they could become a Christian. While others are saying, no, you don't have to take that middle step. You can go right to being a Christian from being a Gentile. And actually, this is a question that's going to come up over and over again in the church. It's a tough one for them, and we'll see it come up again in the future. So what you have in chapter 15 is a great example of how church leaders work through tough issues, how prophetic revelation works in such cases. And how does it work? Well, send your students into the following verses to find it. Chapter 15, verse 5, the leaders of the church come together. Chapter 15, verse 6, there's disputing, and that may not be the best translated word. I think a better word is they discuss it together. And I'm sure that with the various backgrounds that the brethren come from, I imagine that in those meetings nowadays, that there are different opinions and thoughts on different matters. I don't picture them arguing, but I can definitely see there being disagreements. But they discuss the matter. And then in chapter 15, verses 7 through 11, Peter stands up and reveals the will of God after he's heard everybody's thoughts. And now he's speaking for God here. And he announces that they don't need to be circumcised. Now, there are some practices that he says they need to avoid. They need to avoid worshiping idols and things that are worshipped to idols and fornication, but they don't need to be circumcised. Then look in verse 15. They check that the words of the prophets match the scriptures. The words of the prophets will always agree with the scriptures. And then in verse 23, they write letters to the people. They send the message out to the church. Same thing happens nowadays. The proclamation on the family comes to mind, or the living Christ, or the letters that are sent to bishops to read in sacrament meetings. I love verse 25. It says they did it of one accord. They're united in their decisions. And then verse 36, they visit the members to see how they do. And President Nelson right now, he's been traveling all over the world to visit the members of the church and to strengthen them. And the truth that you could identify here, through discussion and direct revelation through his prophet, God guides the church through difficult decisions. And you might also ask, can you think of any examples of some major decisions made in the church that probably came as a result of a pattern just like this one? And they may come up with some of the recent things, 2-hour church, changing the home teaching program to the ministering program, the decision to leave the Boy Scout organization, and many, many others. It's kind of cool to see the parallels between the ancient church and our church. The word restoration makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And you could conclude by testifying of your gratitude that we are led by God through living prophets. And just a brief announcement here. I'm excited to tell you that I put together a website with the show notes available in a much more attractive form, I think, than just posting them on Facebook. Anybody who wishes to use them to create their lesson plans, the material can be easily cut and pasted for that purpose. So check it out at this web address, and I'll also provide a link to it down in the description below. I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, please share it with others that you feel it could benefit. Thank you for watching, and as always, get out there and teach with power.